For the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, I'm David Hood, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, October 2020. For our feature story, one of the most popular topics for diplomacy articles over the years has been the subject of openings. Does that first set of moves in spring 1901 really make that much difference to the endgame result? Which openings for each power are popular, and which are successful? Because our face-to-face tournaments went online this year, and with the advent of the Virtual Diplomacy League, we now have access to data regarding which openings tournament and league players prefer, in conjunction with how each of those games turned out. Later in the broadcast, a panel of hobbyists will analyze these results for virtual games played through mid-September, and will give you their insights on how to improve your starting position in your next diplomacy game. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. The venerable publication Popular Mechanics has featured stories about complex systems and human ingenuity since 1902. But not since until a few weeks ago did diplomacy itself become the focus of a feature story. Three-time world champion Andrew Goff of Australia and his particular form of mind control over a diplomacy board were spotlighted in the digital version of Popular Mechanics, with William Herkowitz basing his piece on the experience he had playing at DixieCon as Russia to Goff's France. The article is entertaining and should be thought-provoking, not only for those of us already in the hobby, but also for Popular Mechanics readers hearing of diplomacy for the first time. To check it out yourself, look for the link in the description field below this broadcast. Speaking of Andrew Goff, the Asia-Pacific Diplomacy League is off and running, with Goffy as one of its promoters and organizers. The league runs a virtual face-to-face game the first Saturday of each month, organized through the Asia-Pacific Diplomacy Discord server. League standings are determined by a combination of a player's results, not only in these virtual games, but also in the face-to-face games played earlier this year, as well as asynchronous games played by email or through a website. In January 2020, the top 7 players will participate in a virtual live final to decide the 2020 Asia-Pacific Diplomacy Tour champion. Currently leading the overall standings are Sasha Haleman, a resident of Thailand, in first, Hong Kong resident Wenzel Frick in second, and Peter McNamara of Australia in the third position. In the fall 2020 edition of Diplomacy World, just released on October 2nd, editor Doug Kent announced a contest for the chance to win a GRI version diplomacy map circa 1975, signed by many hobby luminaries of that day, including game designer Alan Cowhammer, and NADF All-Star player and current Concord, California City Council member Eddie Brisson. Among other features in this issue of Diplomacy World are a discussion of commercially published Irish variants, Brandon Fogel's thoughts on the last 6 months of play using the Tribute scoring system that he co-designed, and my own analysis of the openings data from our summer VCons and VDL games, which we will discuss with our panel of experts later in this broadcast. Read issue 151 yourself at diplomacyworld.net. Contest entries are due by December 1st, with submissions for the next issue of DW due on January 1st. A new edition of the Diplomacy Games podcast is out, featuring everyone's favorite Brisbane-based Australian dippers, Amby and Kaner. An interview with variant designer David Cohen is the main course, followed by the two guys performing a live play of an RT Juggernaut alliance against 5 robotic opponents on WebDip. One of the variants mentioned in the Cohen interview is his new creation, Unconstitutional, which is set in an alternative history where the Articles of Confederation were never replaced with the U.S. Constitution. Consequently, all heck breaks loose as New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and South Carolina are joined by Tecumseh's Confederacy in this 5-player slugfest. The game is currently being playtested on the V Diplomacy website. The Virtual Diplomacy League continued its monthly play on September 26th using the Backstabber interface, with 6 boards being played over 3 different start times. This was designed to allow players from all over the globe to participate on the same day. Highlights included Connecticut resident Dave Smith's 7-center board top as Turkey in 1910, with each of the Western triple participants stuck at 6. Utah's John Anderson taking down yet another board top right after winning Weasel Boot, and Vermonter Morgante Pell dominating his game with an 11-center Austrian finish. Full live stream coverage of all 6 games is available right here on the DBN YouTube and Twitch channels. VDL's next game day is scheduled for Saturday, October 24th, with rounds beginning at 2 a.m., 9 a.m., and 4 p.m., all Central Time. Sign up now on the Virtual Diplomacy League Discord server. For about 6 months, prolific diplomacy writer Brother Board has been discussing the finer points of the game with other DIP players on Saturday mornings on his Discord server. On October 1st, he released his first recording from these sessions as a new podcast called Diplomacy Dojo. In this first episode, Brother analyzes how to influence the Western alliance structure while playing Russia, how to translate a functional juggernaut alliance into a solo for either Russia or Turkey, and the best ways for France to get a jump onto the Italian boot. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or find the episode at brotherboard.com. Florida Man is back. The creator of diplomacy videos on YouTube took a hiatus, but has now returned to producing episodes focused on analyzing games in which he himself is playing, mostly on the Play Diplomacy website. In late September, though, Florida Man released a video introducing diplomacy itself to viewers who have never played before, beginning with a discussion of game designer Alan Cowhammer and the game's Kennedy and Kissinger connections. He then proceeds to explain all the essential rules to give viewers a taste of diplomacy gameplay. Also available on the Florida Man Diplomacy YouTube channel is his after-action report from his 10th place finish overall at the 2020 Liberty Cup. A link to this Introduction to Diplomacy video is posted in the description field below this broadcast. Apparently, our hobby's board game diplomacy has played an important role in artificial intelligence research since at least 1988. Who knew? Jonathan Gray, Adam Lehrer, Anton Bacton, and Noam Brown of Facebook AI Research recently issued the results of their use of an AI player to achieve a rank of 23rd out of 1,128 human players of Gunboat on the web diplomacy platform. In their piece entitled Human Level Performance in No-Press Diplomacy via Equilibrium Search, they describe how diplomacy has been used for decades as a benchmark for multi-agent AI research because of diplomacy's rich mixture of cooperation and competition. Their constructed artificial player achieved an impressive success rate of 25.6% as compared to the average human score of 14.3%. A link to this article is posted below. For those who have been using the pointers discussed in our August 2020 edition of Deadline News to improve your play of Gunboat, you can now also look forward to trying to figure out whether your online Gunboat opponent is some hobby superstar like Doug Moore, a pit kisser on full tilt, or a robot created by Facebook to crush you. Enjoy. This news broadcast is being released around the same time as Tempest in a Teapot, the yearly diplomacy tournament of the Potomac Tea and Knife Society, held this year in a virtual setting. The Diplomacy Broadcast Network's coverage will allow you to follow along with all the dip action right here on this channel. The next virtual face-to-face tournament after that will be Carnage on November 6th through 8th, which will include some rounds hosted using the Asia-Pacific time zone and the rest on Eastern time. Carnage will also feature a top board with interested spectators playing an online game called Bourse, where one invests in the currencies of the great powers, with values rising and falling based on board performance. After that, the next events will be MidCon the following weekend in the United Kingdom, the Melbourne Open, or the Rumble Down Under, on December 4th and 5th, and then the World Diplomacy Classic being held on December 18th through the 20th. For our feature story, let's talk about opening moves. During the summer 2020 con season, we had our face-to-face tournaments all go virtual. DixieCon, Boston Massacre, Liberty Cup, and Weaselmoot. Combined with the formation of the Virtual Diplomacy League and the results of its first 14 recorded games, there were 82 different games played virtually for which we as a hobby have easy access to the game reports on Backstabber. I compiled a list of openings used for each power and compared it to the power ranked at the top of each game finish based upon whichever scoring system was in use for that tournament or league. This data is available in Google Docs form using the link below this broadcast. If you wish, you can pause this broadcast now, pull up that data, and then you can follow along better with the discussion we're getting ready to have. Using a portion of this data, I wrote an article for the October 2020 issue of Diplomacy World regarding the 3 most popular openings used for each power. Let's go deeper than that, though. We have assembled here a panel of experts to expand on and expound upon that Diplomacy World article. Tanya Gill of Ontario currently leads the VDL standings and won the Boston Massacre. Kentucky's Stephen Hogue has jumped into virtual play this summer from DixieCon forward, with DBN viewers having watched him play in numerous league and tournament games. Also joining us from Ontario is Legendary Tactics, the producer of his outstanding video series of the same name on YouTube, who has himself participated in our virtual diplomacy action this summer. And welcome to all of you. Before we dive into our power-by-power analysis for our 82-game set, our viewers may appreciate some initial thoughts about openings overall based on this data. So I think I'll start it off. It can be hard, I think, when looking at this data to compare games that have been played under 3 different scoring systems, which are the ones represented here. DixieCon has its own scoring system, and then Carnage was used a couple of times, and then Tribute, of course, for Weaselmoot and for the VDL games. But opening theory, I think, shouldn't differ too much based on the scoring system used. So that's why I think that this subject is really valuable to players regardless of which scoring system they're about to play under. Steve, did you have any particular thoughts overall before we get started on the power-by-power analysis?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that caught my attention when just looking at the various most common openings from different powers is that for most of the countries, there's one specific set of opening moves that was dominantly popular. A huge gap between the frequency of it. Like for Austria, 51 times that first opening was used, whereas 12 for the second one. England, it goes from 49 to 15, 50 to 19, 48 to 10, etc. But then just France and Italy basically were the only 2 powers that had a pretty relatively even split between the most common openings.
I appreciate that. And I also want to add to that, I think we also have to be careful not to draw too many really firm conclusions from 82 games, because that sounds like a lot, but actually we probably need even more data as we participate in further virtual games. We'll get more information, and maybe we can revisit this a year from now and see what the math looks like then. I tell you what, let's talk now about each of the great powers more specifically. Tanya, talk to us about how Austria has opened during these events and what you think about that.
Yeah, so I've had the fortunate privilege to play Austria quite a bit in the last, I would say, this year, more or less. And what I think about Austria is that it's not the best country to experiment with in 1901. You're surrounded by a bunch of players that would love to carve you up and blitz you if you give them one opportunity to do so. So what's actually really interesting about these top 3 results as Austria is that the only unit that does anything different in the top 3 is Vienna. So you always have Trieste moving to Albania, and you always have Budapest moving to Serbia. And the only thing that differs in all these top 3 is what Vienna does. So I think Austria as a country especially is very much based on diplomacy. What you say to your neighbors is what's going to really get you through it. But just briefly going through all 3 major openings, the most popular one being Vienna moving to Galicia. So, I mean, there's no surprise to me that I think that's just generally objectively the best opening in, like, I would say 90% of circumstances. It keeps Russia from sneaking into Gal, so you don't have that sort of, vulnerability there. And if Italy does sneak into Trieste, you are able to still recover from that position. And then the second most popular is moving Vienna to Trieste. This is a significant drop from, as Steve mentioned before, instead of, 12 games used this opening. So, I mean, I call this the I love Russia opening, where you trust Russia enough to not, have to bounce them out of Galicia, which is great. If you can do that right off the bat, that's fantastic. If you're not too sure about Italy, maybe that's what you want to do, and you go there. My issue with this opening is that initially Warsaw, the army in Warsaw, does not have much to do other than bounce or go to Galicia. So I think people should mostly be using this opening if they're quite certain Russia is keen on going north or just is so friendly that, they can't help but say no. So the third most popular Austrian opening is moving Vienna to Budapest. So I don't think I've ever used this one, but I could be wrong. I can come up with things to do as, an Austria that has a Vienna and Budapest in fall of 1901. I don't think they're particularly great things. I personally do not see why you would move to Budapest instead of getting into Gal, bouncing in Gal, or moving to Trieste. So the surprising part here is that the top scores for this opening are better than the ones where Vienna moves to Trieste. I don't know how to explain that. I'm going to assume that anyone who moves Vienna to Trieste ends up fighting Italy, and then they both go down in flames, and maybe that's going on. I'm not sure. I think there's not enough data to determine that Vienna to Budapest is somehow better than Vienna to Trieste.
What I found interesting mathematically with the third opening there is that one's actually twice as likely. I mean, there's only 10 people using that move, but mathematically they had twice as much success, which like you, I'm a little bit surprised with that. I think the rationale would be twofold. One would be you're trusting Russia. Two would be that you've used your press to somehow arrange a DMZ there. A bounce, I find sometimes can be a little bit, it's great for establishing trust with an ally or potential ally. The problem is you end up in Vienna, and likely Germany is not going to be coming for you. Occasionally they did. I think we saw 4 attempts to go to Tyrolia, but you end up back in Vienna. You're a little bit out of position. If you get that unit into Budapest, suddenly you've got a unit in Budapest, unit in Serbia, and one in Albania, and you're in a really good position to establish some good trust and say, hey, Russia, I'm going to help you into Romania there. And that's something I think that can go a long way.
But I tell you what, Steve, let's move on to England. Tell me what you thought about the results from the English openings in terms of this analysis.
One thing that I've kind of picked up from playing England in my early games is that it feels like as England, you have to watch out because it's really easy for other powers to agree to get England, I think. Because if you both build a fleet, then you can just kind of trust that you're doing what you said, right? It's like, I feel like that's an easy thing to kind of validate with your builds. And then it's like, all right, here we go. So I think a lot of English players who are new try to just not make any enemies early on. And this most common moveset, Norwegian, North, and Yorkshire just kind of does that. It doesn't go to the channel. It's not as anti-Russian as you can be. It doesn't like raise any alarms. So I feel like that's probably why it's the most common. I was surprised that the rate of success, it seems, for moving Liverpool to Eddie is so much better than Yorkshire, because while there is some tactical advantage, I feel like it's really minimal and doesn't actually come into play all that often. So I'm wondering if maybe that's just diplomatic, because I think that's the most anti-Russian you can be, right? And so maybe that makes France and Germany know you're really going north or something. I don't know. I'm curious where the benefit of that opening is coming from.
Tanya, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I personally play England, I like to move to Eddie. I definitely prefer it. I guess like moving to York, maybe you can cover London or something. I'm not really sure. But I definitely do move to Eddie more. But I do think people should be moving to the English Channel more. Like
I was wondering if you were going to say that.
I think that people think it burns more bridges than it actually does. Like, I think France is very easily like, you know what, like, just back off and I'll give you potentially what you want. If you move that fleet to Belgium or use it against Germany in some way, or at least not against, France, I think they're very keen on just being like, all right, I'll forget about that incident, so just like keep going. So I think, like, in defense of the English Channel move, I'd like to see those numbers go up a little bit. Maybe not when I'm France, but just in general.
You and Chris Martin both. Well, legendary tactics. Let's stay in the West and talk to us about Germany.
Sure. Yeah. Germany, I mean, the number one cliche opening, 50 out of 82 people using Fleet Kiel to Denmark, Army Berlin to Kiel, and Army Munich to Ruhr. So this is the classic Blitzkrieg opening, the Danish variant. Usually, I mean, it's not offensive to anyone. You can defend, you can claim centers. It's fairly flexible. I'm not at all surprised with this. In this data set, the best opening move is actually the second most common. Only 19 people used it, and this is the Anschluss opening. So that's the Berlin to Kiel, Kiel to Denmark, Munich to Burgundy. Personally, I love the Burgundy move. So this initial order resulted in 3 times more tops per tries at it. It's called the Anschluss, so it's considered pro-Austrian. And in a way, I know it seems aggressive to be going at France that way, but I think it might also foster potential for an alliance with England. And because then you end up in a strong position if you actually land in Burgundy.
I'm actually shocked that 50 players opened like that. I just feel like whenever, like, from what I've seen, people go crazy with Germany every now and then. Let's move to Silesia or like,
or Tyrolia.
So I feel like I've seen so much of that this year that I'm really shocked that actually 50 of them have not been that. I would really like to see the fall results for Germany and see how those went.
I have to contrast a little bit here and say I was not at all surprised by the German results. I feel like in all the games that I've played so far, I don't know if I've seen a different German opening. Maybe once. Yeah, that was just what I expected. It almost seems like automatic to me. I just assume that that's what's going to happen in Germany. So that's why I think it's fun that going to Burgundy seems to be more successful. And another thing that I wanted to just take a second to point out is it's important to keep in mind that, we don't have the context in this data set to say, okay, so Germany opened Munich to Burgundy 19 times. How many of those 19 did France go to Burgundy? We don't know. And so we don't know the accompanying diplomacy or trickery that might have gone into it. So that there is a little bit of gray area there.
Well, I will say, since I was the one that compiled the data, it is, for most of those moves to Burgundy, the French went to Burgundy also. It probably at 2/3 or more, and sometimes supported themselves to Burgundy. The Germans were sitting in Munich doing nothing, but obviously it still went well. Tell you what, let's finish off the West. Steve, we can stay with you and let you lead off on France.
All right, sure. Well, France was one of the countries I mentioned where the most popular openings were relatively evenly spread out among a few. But we all agree on one thing, and that's where the fleet should go, which is the Mid-Atlantic Ocean, apparently. Most people go there. I don't know, that there's some psychology to maybe pick apart there. Maybe people just perceive that England and France should get along, or maybe they're afraid to just immediately start conflict. I don't know. And, just to talk about the difference between France and England a little bit, because you mentioned earlier how, there's only like 6 or 7 different English openings that showed up at all versus a huge list for France and other countries. Think about it. If you're France, just about any direction, there's some argument to be made that you might want to go there, right? You might want to go to the Channel. You might want to go for Belgium. You might want to go to Piedmont. You might want to go to Iberia. In England, well, West and North just aren't viable options, right? So there's just more to consider, I guess, as France.
What do you think, Legendary?
18 variations, as you say. There's so many different options here. And this is why France, in my mind, is very easy to read right off the hop, because you can tell if they're playing offensively or defensively. Are they going to play safe? Are they going to go for dominance early? Are they worried about someone in particular? There's just so many different permutations there. And David, I know you like sending your Brest fleet to the English Channel. It's not something I tend to do. But it seems that move to Burgundy also bodes well. It's 5 to 6 times more likely to succeed in this data set when that's included. So I think Brest to the Mid-Atlantic Ocean, Paris to Burgundy, and Mar to Spain is really what was most effective here. But I think the reason that move stands out is because it's flexible. You can pivot very nicely. As Stephen says, you can either go into Germany if you want, or you can support somebody into Belgium, or you yourself can go to Belgium. And I think I would frankly normally expect that move to be number one. So it surprises me that only 10 people or 11 people tried that.
Yeah. Now let me just say, I don't go to the Channel that often as France. It's kind of a pet move for me sometimes. But what I really don't like to do is send 2 units into Iberia in 01. I've just always thought that was going the wrong direction. So if I send somebody to the Channel, it means that I've decided that my fleet's going to be one of the people I'm going to put on Belgium, but I'm definitely putting at least another one on Belgium. Tanya, what do you think?
I think France is such a strong defensive country that you can pretty much do almost anything and be okay, right? Which is probably why we see such a variance in the openings, because there's no one, like sometimes if you're some of these other countries and you make one wrong move, you're probably someone's going to jump on that. But with France, it's very unlikely for that to happen. So I think people are way more willing to be more flexible, to change it up, to just try something new, or there's just no sort of consensus on what's the best thing to do with France.
Well, let's contrast that with Turkey, Tanya, because I know you're dying to tell us about Turkey, so go ahead.
So yeah, in comparison to France, I don't think Turkey has much flexibility whatsoever, especially at the early stage of the game. And I think there's an argument to be made that it's just not a flexible country in general. You can't do many exciting or innovative things with this country. At least I don't. There's not too many places for the pieces to initially go. So with the top 3 moves for Turkey, the one consistency, which should be obvious to everyone, is that Constantinople will always move to Bulgaria. So, if you're not moving Con to Bulgaria, you've got a bigger problem probably. So the top opening was Con to Bulgaria, Ankara to Black Sea, and Smyrna to Con. A really high top score rate with this. It says 9.3, which to me is this is sort of how most people do Turkey, and this is how they do well with Turkey. The second one was the, I suppose, infamous Chicago moving Smyrna to Con Smyrna to Armenia instead of Con. And I actually really like this opening, so maybe I should join Chicago. I'm not sure, but I think it could be fun to immediately potentially attack Russia. I think that when games devolve into, AI versus RT, they can be really boring. And this is like a good way as Turkey to sort of switch it up. And it could put Russia, give you a bit more leeway to negotiate with them. Be like, hey, well, why don't you support me to Serbia or something like that? And then the last one for Turkey, which only 4 people did, was moving Ankara to Constantinople instead of the Black Sea, and then moving Smyrna to Armenia anyway. So I thought this one was pretty interesting. I'm imagining it has something to do with agreeing with Russia to bounce in Armenia and leave the Black Sea open. So potentially either that or having a swap, like a Constantinople-Sevastopol swap. That's a good way to do it. Either way, it was not very heavily utilized, and there's probably good reasons for that. So, yeah.
I wish I could say that in the old days, we used to call that the Sevcon shuffle. When the Turks go into Sevastopol and the Russians move their fleet down to Khan. I hate to say this, but in none of the 4 cases did that happen. Legendary, what do you think here?
Well, to me, that Black Sea is the most important space for Russia and for Turkey. And if one of them gets dominance in that spot, it can be pretty dangerous for the other. So that seems to be a given. However, given the data, I mean, we only had 4 people try the shuffle there, but 1 out of 4 got a board top. So statistically, that one is twice as good as the other 2, but it's a very, very small set of data. So I guess I would like to see more people trying. I wouldn't do it myself. I don't like going to Armenia, because if Austria is coming for you and you make a move against Russia, I mean, you're toast. You're out of the game so fast. So it's just, for me, a little bit too aggressive early on. But I mean, some of these people had a good result there. So maybe with more data on that, we might find that effective. So.
Well, I tell you what, with initial aggression being your theme, that's a great segue to Italy, where that's usually not what they do.
Absolutely. So we can safely say that Italy had the worst outcome in all of these tournaments. I think we would frankly expect that to happen as well. What surprised me most was that there's 15 variations on the opening. That seems very high to me, because there doesn't seem to be that many possible combinations, but somehow these tournament players found it. So, I mean, that was the same number of variations that Russia had, and Russia has an extra piece. My personal favorite is the Alpine opening. So Fleet Naples to Ionian, Army Rome to Venice, and Army Venice to Piedmont. And I love this one because it's versatile. You don't need to convoy to Tunis, because I find that army gets trapped. And if you're not doing the Lepanto, I don't like that army being trapped down there. But this maneuver, the Alpine maneuver, defends or attacks against either Italy or Austria. So it gives you some flexibility to set up against either of those. And I think it's a really dynamic opening. But I notice only 4 people use this, and there were no tops with this.
And if you don't mind me being the old guy again, in the old days, Venice to Piedmont used to be way more popular. I'm not positive why that has changed, except that the AI alliances, which used to be sort of something that you sometimes did, has become something that almost everybody now does all the time. Tell you what, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to Russia and start off the comments myself. One thing that I was surprised about, and I mentioned this in my Diplomacy World article, was the times that Russia went to Romania instead of the Black Sea was fairly small. I like to come up with ways not only to make a deal about Black Sea if I'm the Russians, but frankly, to get my fleet piffed so that I can rebuild it. And so a way to do that is to go on the land somewhere where you can get attacked with support so you can rebuild it. Because the Russian fleet is a source of instability throughout the entire game. Unless you're going to go after Turkey, that's fine. You need your fleet. But if you're not going to immediately go after Turkey, and particularly when you're on defense, that fleet is often worthless. And so you're better off changing it into an army.
That is brazen, David.
What do you think about Russia?
Sure.
I love my Southern Russian fleet. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, I'm not. I mean, it sometimes can be very helpful, but only if I need it against the Turks. It's not good against anybody else.
Well, eventually you're going to need it against the Turks. So you don't solo without taking some of Turkey's dots, do you, Dave?
No, but the best way to get that is to slip into Armenia when they're not watching.
All right. Well, I mean, what stands out to me about the Russian data is the opening at the top is exactly what I expect. And in the 2 games that I've played Russia in these virtual face-to-face games, that's the opening I've used both times, I'm pretty sure, which is, the fleet to Gulf of Bothnia, Warsaw to Galicia, Moscow to Ukraine, and Sev to Black. It's just, I feel like it's just the middle ground in so many ways, because when you're Russia, you're thinking, you're wanting to get Sweden, right? So if you can diplomatically set it up, or maybe, Germany has some specific request for you or whatever, but you're trying not to aggravate anyone as Russia, right? Because you start out the biggest, you don't want to be the immediate target. It's kind of easy for England and Germany to decide that Russia is the enemy if neither of them is a very confrontational kind of person. So, yeah, and it gives you, 2 on Romania, which you kind of would like to secure Romania if possible, right? And it, just make sure you have units in the south in case people try to team up against you. So no surprises to me that it's the most common. And, I will say this, though. I always enjoy seeing someone who changes things up as Russia and builds a lot of Russian or northern fleets and does stuff like that, because you have so many options as Russia, right? Because you have that extra unit.
In the interest of time, Steve, I want to get to the conclusion of this discussion. So give us your final thoughts about either this data or openings in general.
What I've experienced so far in deciding on openings is that my general takeaway has been I've not yet been able to have a situation where I could get someone to commit to an alliance with me like right away in spring of 01, and then it actually lasted. I'm still working on how to make that happen. So for me, my openings have become very much leave my options open, because no matter how well my spring 01 negotiations go, I'm probably going to have the wrong impression about somebody, or something's going to surprise me. And then my plan that if you make an aggressive opening that's very direct, and then something didn't go the way you thought, your game might end very quickly. So there's, maybe some risk to doing atypical moves. And, as a new player, I just want to get as much experience in these games as I can. So maybe I'm a little more conserved right now. Maybe other players think the same way. And that's why you see, super common openings for most of the countries.
Tanya, last word, as it should be, is with you.
I appreciate it. I think it's really interesting to look at the data, and I think it's fun, but I really don't think these opening moves or 1901 often has, it's not going to make or could break, but the overall game. So I think that while it's fun to analyze these, the magic happens in 1902, later on, more or less. So that's kind of my thoughts. I think it's fun to see trends and see what people are doing, and how this would look, 5 years ago. I'd like to see that. See how we're all sort of just adapting to what we think the powers are like. So maybe, this video could change how Italy's play. It should. So
don't hold in Venice.
Exactly. But yeah,
I guess we'll find out. Well, I want to thank everyone for being involved in this, and I enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. And thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline News. If you have any news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. For our other broadcast offerings, visit our website at diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.